Suddenly, a realization occurred to him. The tender fragrance worked fast, and usually all control would be lost the moment one's blood rushed to their brain. So how had he managed to stay afloat until now? Was the only reason really the exceptional steadiness of his mind? With that thought, Julien drew a long breath and tilted his head. He called out to the boy's silhouette at the cave's entrance, who was still looking indecisive about entering. "You, come in." The young soldier looked like he wanted to dash over to his side immediately, but after a few steps he seemed to remember Julien's furious instruction, "Don't come in, no matter what you hear," and he hesitated. Julien felt terrible for changing his mind so quickly, but he called to him again, "Just come inside now." The boy stopped hesitating and rushed in. The cave's interior was a long, narrow tunnel, warm and humid. Darkness shrouded the space. One couldn't even see their hand in front of their face. That boy used Julien's rasping breath to find where he lay. "Put down your sword. Put it on the ground," Julien instructed. "Right next to me, not too far away." "Yes, sir." The young soldier heeded him and handed over his only defense, placing it where Julien could easily reach. "Please help me up," Julien asked. The boy half knelt next to him and extended both arms to help support Julien. However, when he reached out, he touched not fabric, but feverish skin. His hands immediately shrank back. Julien felt burned by the boy's hot hands, and only then did he remember he'd torn off his upper robes in his manic state. A man naked from the waist up usually wasn't anything scandalous, though the current circumstances were slightly awkward. But there was no need to highlight their predicament. They just needed to do what they must. The boy seemed to realize it as well, and he didn't wait for Julien to say anything. He simply reached out again to circle his arm around Julien's bare shoulders, helping him up, and then immediately letting go. Julien leaned against the wall of the tunnel, and with his back pressed against the cool rock, he felt some relief. Noticing that the boy had backed a few steps away, he hurriedly said, "Wait, don't leave yet." That young soldier heeded his every word. He halted immediately. "Cut off a lock of my hair," Julien said. "I need it for something." The boy acknowledged the order and reached out again, but the darkness made him clumsy, and with Julien's long locks tied cleanly behind his back, his first contact wasn't the man's hair. Instead, his fingers met the skin of Julien's chest, skin that was soft and supple with a light mist of sweat. Julien was already in torment from that touch when the boy accidentally brushed against something sensitive. It was like a bolt of lightning jolted through his chest. Pleasure spread throughout his whole body, forcing a soft moan from him. The pair in that cave instantly froze. The flower Yao outside the cave were desperately trying to listen in, so how could they miss it? They giggled. "My gosh, what are they doing in there? So embarrassing, I dare not listen." Julien gritted his teeth at the sound of them mocking his suffering. "You!" Hearing Julien's fury, the boy immediately dropped his hands, afraid to make any more contact. Obviously, Julien wasn't furious at him. In his eyes, that little soldier was nothing more than a child. He softened his tone, thinking the boy was probably scared of offending him. "Don't panic. Just keep going," he said. "Don't mind them." "Yes, sir," the boy croaked. Still, he was clearly flustered. He felt up everywhere he shouldn't, and every time he found that he'd touched the wrong place, his hands shrunk back. In the end, the only way he found Julien's hair was to trace his hands up that bare chest, sparking unspeakable pleasure and agony in Julien. Such misery. Julien longed to smash his head against the tunnel wall and knock himself out for good. Finally, the boy felt his way to Julien's throbbing Adam's apple and reached behind his neck to grasp a lock of hair. With only a few strands in his grip, he carefully cut them with the sword. "Your Highness, it's done," he cried immediately. Another small surge of strength returned to Julien, and he raised his palm. "Give me your hand." The boy obeyed, and Julien retrieved the long, thin strands and tied them in a knot on one of his fingers. "Your Highness, what's this?" the boy asked with a quavering voice, baffled. Julien sighed. "The flower Yao's poison is about to enter the second stage. I need to borrow your sword. If anything wants to harm you later, raise this hand and it will protect you. Now leave." A moment later, the young soldier returned to the entrance of the cave. The flower Yao grew ratty again. "You're out? Finally! Blocking us outside like that while you went in to have fun yourself. You're not very nice, kiddo." Meanwhile, Julien could feel more strength surging through his limbs. He inhaled deeply and grabbed the young soldier's worn sword in his right hand. He composed himself, then raised the sword and made a cut on his left arm. In a flash, it was like the fog had lifted, and his senses slowly returned. He knew it. Blood streamed down Shilian's left arm, but it was like he'd finally grasped a lifeline in the middle of the chaos. The fragrance of the land of the tender could aggravate one's temper and arouse deep, slumbering urges. Typically, the stronger the repressed urge, the stronger the rebound after breathing in the fragrance. As for what Shilian had repressed, other than lust, it was the urge to kill. We have an illustration. The murderous bloodlust couldn't be directed at nefarious creatures. He had slain many such evils in the past, so he'd never repressed that desire. The target had to be a human or god to inflict a sense of transgression. Before entering the cave, Shilian had cut himself to draw the arrays, and so blood was spilled. It was somewhat effective against the tender fragrance, because injuring himself was also a form of inflicting harm. At the end of the day, lust and murder were both wildly aggressive desires. Shilian had even heard that some consider them to stem from the same origin, their nature one and the same. Using himself as evidence of this theory, there was indeed an alternative method to pass the current trial. Sure of his own reasoning, Shilian slashed another cut on his left arm without hesitation, and every cut brought more wisps of clarity to his mind. He was too busy rejoicing at this to realize that the tender fragrance was stirring more evil within his body. The instant his bloodlust was satiated, a wave of pleasure crashed over him. That sudden urge coursed through every inch of him from head to toe, effortlessly breaking the defensive walls he had painstakingly built. By the time Shilian had realized it, he was already quietly moaning. If he wasn't alone in the cave, Shilian wouldn't be able to believe that sound came from his throat. He shuddered violently, and his eyes grew wide as he thought, "This method should have worked. Why would this happen?" He glanced at the sword and suddenly remembered. The young soldier had used it to cut the stems of the flower yao and to strike the humanoid flower yao. The blade was covered in sap from the land of tenders. He used a fifth of his power to make the first cut on his arm, but he could only achieve the same relief if he used a third of his power to make the next cut. It was like drinking poison to quench his thirst. The madness must have gone to his head, as he otherwise surely would have noticed this. Shilian cursed himself internally, but as he'd already committed to the act, he could only rip off a piece of his left sleeve to wipe madly at the sword, then tear off his right sleeve to stuff it in his mouth, biting down on it mullishly and doing his best to retain himself. The quiet moans were forcibly cut off by bitten lips and gritted teeth, but noises echoed within caves, so every small sound was amplified and reverberated outward. The boy had heeded his instructions and covered his eyes, using only his sense of hearing to work, and in doing so, his ears became more sensitive. There was no way he had missed hearing something strange. Unable to hold back any longer, the boy asked with a quavering voice, "Your Highness?" Wallowing in such an unspeakable state was the biggest humiliation of Shilian's life. He could hardly imagine what would happen should anyone see him like this. Even submerged in darkness, he could not tolerate the thought. "Don't come in!" he yelled. However, that piece of cloth was still stuffed in his mouth, and his command just sounded like muffled whimpering, exceedingly pitiful and wretched. The young soldier became even more anxious at the sound. Shilian's left arm was already bleeding profusely from that self-inflicted gash, but at the end of the day, it was only self-harm, not murder, and so the urge wasn't entirely fulfilled. His mouth slackened, and the piece of cloth fell from his lips. Shilian stabbed his left leg next, with increasing brutality. It was a deep stab, and the thick sound of the blade penetrating his flesh echoed through the cave. The young soldier couldn't stand back anymore, and dropped his hands to rush toward him, but the sound of his hurried footsteps had Shilian scrambling away in terror. Even when his back was pressed against the wall, he continued to push backward, cowering. "No, no, no! Don't come near me, don't!" The second blood barrier by the entrance of the cave was drawn especially to stop Shilian, but it wouldn't stop the boy. He still had a chance to return to safety. The poison from the tender fragrance was about to enter the second stage, and if that boy approached, Shilian could end his life right then and there, giving him no chance to escape. He was terrified he'd killed a child by accident. All he could do was avoid him. The young soldier heard his panic in his voice, and called out in concern and confusion, "Your Highness!" The bloodlust was boiling in his veins. He raised the worn sword with his shuddering hand, and a voice inside his head screamed, "I will not die! I will not die! I will not die!" The next moment, in a split-second decision, he turned his blade. In the darkness, the young soldier could see the flash of cold metal, and he cried, "Your Highness!" The sword struck, penetrating Shilian's own stomach. He'd nailed himself firmly onto the ground. A sharp pain exploded from his abdomen, spreading throughout his whole body and dispersing the heat. Julien's hands gripped the hilt tightly, and his eyes flashed. He choked out a cough, and a thin trail of blood flowed down from the corner of his lips. His breathing stopped, and his body stilled. The young soldier was left in dumbfounded shock, and he fell to his knees next to his body. Screeching and shrieking began outside the cave. "Who are you?" The voices of the flower yow were delicate but shrill, and their shrieks were piercing to the ear. Yet there was another who thundered louder, dominating all their cries. "What the hell?" Hearing that angry roar, Julien suddenly sucked in a breath anew. "Fengshen." "Land of the Tenders," another muffled voice said. "If you don't want to get poisoned, cover your face." That was Muqing, of course, who clearly already had his face covered. Fengshen seemed to have seen something and gave an angry muffled Fengshen seemed to have seen something and gave an angry muffled shout through the suggested face covering. "Is that Your Highness? Your Highness, fuck, what the fuck? What's the meaning of this?" Muqing let out an then commented, "What an indecent sight. How outrageous." His tone didn't sound as angry as Fengshen's, more like he was reacting to a bad joke. Julien was still inside the cave and couldn't hear exactly what they were saying, but he could guess that those flower yow were probably parading their naked selves before them and generally being highly inappropriate. Fengshen was cursing uproariously. "Hurry and get rid of them now! Don't let anyone else see this!" Soon, all he heard was the screaming and cursing of the female yow, which gradually faded. "Make sure to exterminate them thoroughly," Muqing lectured. "The scent from this type of yow is poisonous, and if there are any leftover seedlings, they'll just come back." Julien sucked in a breath, waited, then coughed weakly once. The other two immediately heard him and charged to the cave, yelling, "Your Highness, are you in there?" "I'm here," Julien replied. Even though he tried to steady his voice, it was still weaker than normal. The two of them rushed over but were stopped by the barrier outside the cave's entrance. However, they were familiar with the rays drawn by Julien, and knew how to break them. Fengshen ignited a palm torch as he walked in, but before the deepest part of the cave was illuminated, he suddenly called out, "Who's there?" Muqing was alarmed as well. "Is there someone else in the cave?" "Don't worry, just a little soldier," Julien said. The two calmed down and entered. The firelight brightened the entire cave with a warm orangey glow and illuminated Julien, who lay there sprawled on the ground, his long hair strewn around him, his upper robes completely peeled off, and a long sword impaling his abdomen and nailing him to the ground. The two were horrified by this sight. Fengshen leaned down. "Who did this?" "Me," Julien replied. Muqing was aghast. "What happened?" Julien shook his head. "I don't want to talk about it. I only went this far because there was no other way. Hurry and free me." Muqing approached and pulled out the sword with a frown, tossing it to the side with a clang. The young soldier retrieved it. Fengshen helped Julien sit up and covered him with an outer robe. Only then did Julien finally give them a rough account of his ghastly night with the Land of the Tenders. "You two came faster than I expected. Where's Qirong?" "Qirong got locked up in the palace by the king," Fengshen said. "He's always so showy, so of course he was an easy target. But he knew to come find us as soon as he got back, so at least his head's clear enough for that." It seemed that as much as Qirong despised his two attendants, he still acknowledged how competent they were. The two had planned to have one stay behind to guard the city, but Qirong was screaming and howling and clutching a sword smeared in Julien's blood, so they thought the danger might be greater than they expected, and decided to come together. Beishi Hill was thick with the air of evil, so it wasn't hard to pinpoint their location and make their way there quickly. Although Julien possessed an ascended body, normal blades could not hurt his cultivated foundation, and a jab like this wouldn't kill him. He had still never truly lost a battle of life and death in his 20 years. This was the very first time he'd been so badly wounded, and he'd need time to recover, so Fengshen carried him on his back on their return to the imperial capital. An excruciating, foreign pain from his stomach stabbed him in waves, and Julien furrowed his brows as he tried to restrain himself. "Did you two run into anything on your way here?" "No," Muqing replied. Julien sucked in a breath and said, "Be careful. There are inhuman creatures about." He had wanted to tell them about that white-clothed creature, but he was thoroughly exhausted. From the corner of his eye, he could see the young soldier following behind with that bloody iron sword still in hand, and the sight finally allowed him to relax. He closed his eyes and fell deeply asleep to restore his energy. He had capriciously descended into the mortal realm over 2 months ago, and ever since Julien had not once closed his eyes to rest. With the pressure on him building up day after day, this whole ordeal had finally crushed him. He was comatose for 3 full days. On the 3rd day, he woke up with a start and found himself staring at a glamorous, beautiful ceiling. He was in the palace, inside his bedchamber. He immediately sat up. Fengshen! Fengshen was just outside, testing his bow, and entered when he heard the call. Your Highness! Julien's stomach injury had long since healed, and he immediately rolled out of bed. Was I out for a long time? Did anything happen? Relax, Fengshen said. It was only a few days. There were no enemy attacks. If there had been, wouldn't I have woken you up? Go back to bed. You forgot your shoes again. Finally reassured, Julien sat back down on the bed. After a pause, he asked, Where's Mooching? Just then, Mooching walked in too, with a set of prepared robes in his hands. Here. He attended to dressing the crown prince. Fengshen spoke up behind them. Even though there hasn't been a battle in the past few days, we did find something out. Which is? Julien asked. Didn't we say before that something's off with Yong'an? That they might have gotten reinforcements somehow? Fengshen began. We went to scout Beiji Hill and saw several people that were dressed like our citizens who had strange accents. They didn't seem like they were from Shinle. I captured them, and sure enough, there are other kingdoms supporting them from the shadows, secretly shipping them supplies and arms. With so many people of Yong'an crammed on that wild mountain hill, there was no way they'd survive all this time on wild roots and weeds. Fengshen cussed. Fucking fakers. Pretending to be all friendly, then rubbing elbows with the enemy at a time like this. They're just happy for the chance to throw Shinle into complete chaos. The kingdom of Shinle possessed a vast territory with bountiful resources. Its wealth was abundant, its production of precious jewels plentiful. Nearby kingdoms had long watched them with envious eyes. Julien had expected this and shook his head gravely. He recalled something else and asked, Where's that boy? Which one? Fengshen asked. Oh, the little soldier. We were busy rushing you to the state preceptor that day, so no one paid him any mind. He probably went back to his troop. Now dressed, Julien lowered his arms and sat down with poise on the bed. That child was fairly skilled. I think he's got a lot of potential with the saber. If he's taught well, he'd be spectacular when he's older, he said. Mooching, remember to find him for me when you get a chance. Get him settled somehow. He could be appointed. Julien loved talented martial artists. He always just had to appoint them to his side, so he could watch them every day and soak in delight. This wasn't the first time he had made such comments, but it was the first time they were directed at a child. Mooching heard him make those compliments. Really good potential with the saber, spectacular when he's older, and his expression turned unreadable. He scrunched up the hairband he'd just untied from Julien's head, and turned around to throw it to the side. Fengshen, on the other hand, remarked, That brat only looked about 14 or 15. Isn't that too young? What's he going to do after being appointed? In a flat voice, Mooching remarked upon the order as well. I don't think it's proper. It'd be against military rules. A god can descend into the mortal realm, so what can military rules do to me? Julien said, then continued his praise. You two should have seen the way he killed those Binu. His stance was so good. Speaking of Binu, the strange, white-clothed creature flashed in Julien's mind. Your Highness, why did Yao like those land of tenders appear on Beiji Hill? Fengshen asked. That's never happened before. Julien rose to his feet. That's what I wanted to tell you two that day. Now that he finally had the time, he recounted his meeting with the one who wore the crying, smiling mask. The three of them talked it over, and for fear of dereliction of duty, they decided in the end that it was better to report it to the heavens. So Julien left his bedchamber, met briefly with the king and queen, and hurried to the Palace of Divine Might on Mount Taikang. In the past, Julien would have gone straight to the heavenly capital directly to tell Junwu face to face. Yet the circumstances had changed. He deserted the heavenly capital of his own volition. So that would be like asking for the keys back. Even if he wanted to return now, the doors would be locked. Furthermore, he'd left in such an upset and spoken with such friction that the Palace of Divine Might that he was a little embarrassed to face Junwu. Thus, with great reverence, he paid his respects with a few giant sticks of incense in the Palace of Divine Might, and passed on the message to the divine statue of the Heavenly Emperor. Once Junwu was available, he would hear it. However, Junwu regularly received thousands upon thousands of incense respects, an overwhelming amount, with those of grand believers mixed in. Whether he would hear this particular message would depend entirely on chance. Julien didn't dare stay absent for too long, so he immediately returned to the battlefront to continue his watch over the city. Maybe it was because the damage inflicted in the first battle was too great, and their reinforcements had frequently been cut off by Feng Xin and Mu Qing's covert sabotage, but Yong'an changed tactics. They didn't make another reckless charge. There were a few smaller battles over the next few months, but no grave losses. Compared to that first battle, these little bouts were nothing. That strange white-clothed creature didn't appear again either. The tension in the imperial capital of Shinla dissipated with this relative peace. Shi Lian also found a rare chance to leave the front lines, and he strolled through the capital to relax a bit. He stepped onto a small stone bridge, stirring the long, thin branches of the weeping willow next to the bridge as he did. He watched the lively red koi fish swish their tails, feeling envious at the sight of them swimming so happily through the coursing waters below. He had been lost in thought for a while when he suddenly felt eyes staring at him from behind. When he turned his head, however, there was no one there. Though puzzling, he didn't sense any malicious or killing intent, so Shi Lian paid it no mind. After crossing the bridge, he strolled along the grand avenue of divine might, and passerby on the road bowed to him excitedly, or reverently, or joyfully, greeting him as Your Highness. Shi Lian nodded and smiled, but after walking for a while, he felt that gaze on his back again. This time he did pay it mind, and whipped around without warning to catch the culprit in the act. Beneath a willow tree, he saw the flash of a figure dodging behind the trunk. Shi Lian strode forward and was about to seize the person when he realized with a start that it was a boy with his head wrapped in bandages. Even with bandages wrapped all around his head, the boy still covered his face with his crossed arms, leaving only a bright eye peeking through his patched sleeves. Your Highness, I didn't mean to, he stammered. Shi Lian pointed at him. You're the one from that night. He trailed off as he recalled the exact details of what had transpired that night many months ago. Images filled his mind, and his face reddened at the memory and the extent of his discomposure. Feeling slightly awkward, he hurriedly cleared his throat. So it was you. I was going to look for you a while back, but with so much on my plate I'd forgotten. Aren't you a soldier in the army? Why are you in the city? The boy was taken aback. I'm not in the army anymore, he replied a little mopingly. Huh? Why not? Shi Lian asked, bewildered. The boy was even more bewildered. I got kicked out. Your Highness, did you not know? Shi Lian was perplexed. Know what? He had clearly told Mu Qing that this child was a good sprout, and that he should be settled and appointed. So why was he kicked out of the army after Shi Lian's specific directions? The boy looked both excited and happy, and he dropped his arms immediately. So your Highness didn't know? I thought... Shi Lian was getting more and more curious. Come, tell me. Why did you get kicked out? Who kicked you out? Why did you think I would know? Also, you thought what? The boy took a step toward him, but before he could speak, a loud, horrified scream rang out from the grand avenue of divine might. Ah! Shi Lian whipped his head around and saw a man running and stumbling in his direction, holding his face. And that is chapter 37.